Okay, hello everybody. This is Dr. Jenkins, and here we are at the protein chapter. This is going to be a good one. We're going to really, hopefully, give you some more insight into protein. It is important. We're going to talk about the really important ones and hopefully dispel some of the rumors out there. All right, as usual, we're going to follow the same structure for each chapter of a macronutrient. So of course, first we're going to talk about the structure, function. Then we're going to talk about how the body digests, absorbs, and then metabolizes it. And then we're going to talk about protein needs around exercise. Okay. Now, you know by now, you only have to know the important things that I'm pointing out. So, as per usual, you don't need to know the specific structure. I'm not going to ask you the amine group, the acid group, and so forth. But let me point out some of the important structural things about protein. So, the first important thing is that proteins contain nitrogen. Excuse me. As a matter of fact, the word amino means contains nitrogen. This is different from carbohydrates and lipids. Carbohydrates and lipids are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but not nitrogen. So, I'm pouring myself some tea. Hope you don't mind. Keep myself awake and ready to go. One of the things that makes protein so unique is that it contains nitrogen. This is what makes protein, which is a great thing, but it's what makes protein a little bit more difficult to deal with. Okay? Now, we already know proteins are made up of amino acids. We already know there are 20 different types of amino acids. So, every protein in our body, every protein that we ingest through food is made up of some combination of these 20. They can be shorter chains of amino acids, maybe 100, or they can be really long, up to thousands. Excuse me. Not sure what got into my throat today. So again, that nitrogen is what makes protein, but on the other side of the coin, it's what makes protein difficult for our body to break down. Okay, let's for a moment just have a closer look at the amino acid. Each amino acid has similar parts. Each amino acid has an amine group, an acid group, and a side chain, but they can be arranged a little bit differently. If we look just for a moment, do you see the N in there? Nitrogen. That is what makes protein unique. Contains nitrogen. Now, the 4 parts of each amino acid are amine groups, acid groups, central carbon, but what I want to point out is the side chain. I'm never going to ask you to draw an amino acid, but what I do want to point out is that side chain, that is what's different between amino acids. The amine group, the central carbon, the acid group, they're pretty much stable between amino acids. But what makes an amino acid different, what makes one amino acid different from another, is that side chain. Okay, I'm not going to ask you to draw this, but if I ask you about which part of the amino acid structure is different, you're going to say side chain. So I'm not going to ask you any specifics, but I just gave you some examples. If we look at glycine, glycine is an example of an amino acid versus aspartic acid, another amino acid. The amine group is the same. The acid group is the same. These kind of like Tetris pieces, haha. But what is different is the side chain. The side chain in glycine is more square. The side chain in aspartic acid is more like an L. So it's the side chain that makes it different. This structure overall is more complex than the structure of carbohydrates and fats. Here are the 20 amino acids. You don't need to know all of them. I am going to point out some that will be particularly important, but come on, folks, you certainly don't need to know all 20. But let's review some things. We already know, so this is going to be a review. We already know what's the difference between essential amino acids versus non-essential amino acids. You know this already. The essential amino acids are that the body cannot make. Therefore, it's essential that we get them through the diet. Of the total of 20, 9 are essential and must be obtained through diet. On the other hand, non-essential, let me go with green. I feel like green would be good with this, would stand out. Non-essential, oh, it's too bright. Non-essential means that our body can produce it. 11 out of the 20 are considered non-essential. That's what you need to know. Should be a review. You might read indispensable and dispensable, but we're going to use the words essential amino acids versus non-essential. Essential, our body cannot make, and we must get it through our diet. 9 of the 20 are essential. Non-essential, our body can make, and 11 out of the 20 are considered non-essential. As an aside, this will not be on your quiz or any exams, but maybe you've heard of tryptophan. So if I go back to that list, one example of tryptophan, this is an essential amino acid found in turkey. So you may have heard one reason why you might be sleepy after eating turkey on Thanksgiving is because of tryptophan. Not necessarily true, but just as an example of one you might have heard of, but not going to be any quizzes or exams. However, now I want to talk about some amino acids that I do want you to know. I'm going to go back for a moment to this slide. So I purposely put an arrow beside leucine. Leucine is an amino acid we're going to talk about quite a bit. We're also going to talk about isoleucine and lysine. But the one I want to start with is leucine. I would like you to know a little bit about leucine. First of all, leucine is an essential amino acid. So we should know that leucine is an essential amino acid. Leucine is an essential amino acid. And what I want to point out to you is leucine is closest in composition to our skeletal muscle tissue. This diagram is kind of weird maybe, but let me tell you how to read this. Let me go with yellow. So we can see human muscle right here. And what this bar graph is trying to show you, the leucine concentration of different types of protein. Look at the leucine concentration of skeletal muscle. Everything that was in red that I've now put as yellow, that is how much of human muscle is made up of leucine. In other words, if we look at all of the essential amino acids in leucine, this much of it. If I follow this over to here, the majority of skeletal muscle is made up of leucine. I'm not going to ask you the percentage or anything like that, but I could ask you a question such as, which amino acid is closest in structure to human muscle? And you would say leucine. Leucine is the amino acid that's closest to the structure of the muscle we have in our body. We're going to talk about this later. When we look at some of the commonly used supplements and ergogenic aids, branched-chain amino acids in particular, they're going to have in them leucine. Because if we're trying to make sure we have enough protein as an athlete, you really want to have leucine, because that's what's already most closest to our human skeletal muscle, and leucine can be used to build skeletal muscle. By the way, folks, not every amino acid can be used to build muscle. So just because it contains amino acids doesn't mean that it's a type of amino acid that our body can use to make muscle. Interesting, right? One of the primary amino acids we can use to make muscle is leucine. And the reason why is because it's already very close in structure to our human skeletal muscle. Very cool. Okay. You might not think it's cool, but I'm trying. It is kind of cool. All right, so a couple more words about structure. So we're going to keep it simple. What have we said so far? We've said that proteins are made up of amino acids. We said that there's two types of amino acids, essential and non-essential. You need to know those definitions and how many are each. Then we talked about leucine. Leucine is an essential amino acid that is most close to our own skeletal muscle composition. Now let's talk about the type of chemical bond that connects these amino acids. If each protein is made up of some kind of chain of amino acids, which it is, let's just identify the type of chemical bond that joins the amino acids. The type of chemical bond that joins the amino acids in our body, they're called peptide bonds. You don't have to know the specifics or the types, but the type of chemical bond that joins amino acids are called peptide bonds. You don't need to know dipeptide, tripeptide, or polypeptide. Just know that it's a peptide bond that joins amino acids. If you're wondering, this would be a tripeptide. Insulin, the hormone we talked about that regulates blood sugar levels, it's a long chain. It's a long chain of amino acids, 3 or more amino acids joined together. But many times, again, this is all extra, but many times, instead of just having a long chain of amino acids, those long chains of amino acids curl together. And then we have multiple chains of amino acids that curl together into these balls and form a big, huge polypeptide. So the structures of protein can get really, really complex. By the way, this is what hemoglobin looks like. Hemoglobin is what sits on the surface of red blood cells and transports oxygen. But look at how structurally complex that is. All right. So I'm just going to show you some pictures of how amino acids can come together. I already told you that we can have a linear chain. We can have a really complex globule where we have these linear chains that form circles, and then we have multiple circles that come together. We talked in this class already about skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle, the proteins form in these linear bands. So the amino acids can come together in many different ways. All right, let's talk about functions. I'm trying to make it easier for you, and we've already reviewed this. We've already introduced it. I believe it was chapter 2. We're going to break down the functions of protein into 3 main categories. 1 is structure. 2 is that proteins are used to form chemicals. And then 3, protein is our, last resort for energy. So make sure you review structure. What are some examples of how our body uses protein for structure? Well, muscles. We have over 600 skeletal muscles. Whew! But also smooth muscle that lines our GI tract. that lines arteries. Smooth muscle lines the wall of the uterus in women. Also, cardiac muscle that makes up our heart, allows us to pump blood. All made up of protein, protein, protein. Bones, ligaments, and tendons, protein, protein, protein. Specifically, the type of protein that makes up these is more of a collagen protein. Skin. We tend to not think about our skin, but your skin is the largest organ in your body, made up of protein. So make sure you review all these examples. But it's this number 2 function that I think we don't think about enough. Yes, we probably have an idea that protein is used for structure, but you may not know that protein is used to form all these important chemicals. Proteins are used to form hormones. Hormones that are important to an athlete are really all of them, but think about insulin. We talked about that. You should know this, right? Insulin is one of the hormones that helps to regulate blood sugar. Insulin is released when blood sugar is too high. Insulin goes to the liver, tells the liver to take sugar out of the blood and store it. Enzymes, all those enzymes in our body that speed up chemical reactions. We talked about that in the digestive chapter. They're made up of protein. Antibodies. You'll have to excuse these random circles when I brought this over from my laptop onto this iPad. Sometimes it brings over these weird circles, so not supposed to be there. Antibodies. Antibodies help us fight disease. Guess what? Made up of protein. I mentioned hemoglobin. You should be able to match the function with these chemicals, right? Antibodies. Immunity, fight disease. Hemoglobin carries oxygen on the red blood cell surface. Hormones, important chemical messengers. Enzymes, speed up chemical reactions. All right, and that's just a short list. I didn't even talk about all of the chemicals that are made up of protein. There's so many others. Neurotransmitters is a big one, but I just tried to pick a couple to get you started. So all these important chemicals made up of protein. And of course, our number 3 function of protein, energy, but only in small amounts. You need to know that number. I've been saying this over and over and over again. What do our muscles want to rely on most for energy? Carbohydrates and fat. Your muscles want to rely most on carbohydrates and fat, and then only a little bit for protein. This is on purpose, folks. Your body is designed to have most of its protein go towards the other functions. We want most of the protein to go towards structure and forming chemicals. If we don't bring in enough carbohydrates or fat, if you don't have enough carbohydrates and fat, your body is going to be forced to burn more protein. But that's not good. We don't want to burn more protein than 10 to 15%. If your body is forced to burn more protein, that's going to take some of the protein away from its ability to give structure to muscles and to form hormones. Alrighty. Okay, so let's talk about dietary recommendations. So, as usual, we're following this nice organized format. We talked about the structure and the function. Now, let's talk a little bit about dietary recommendations. We already know somewhere between about 10 to 35%. Sometimes you might see it 15 to 30. Somewhere around there should come from protein. Why do we not need as much? I mean, remember carbohydrates. How much of our diet should come from carbohydrates? These should be etched in your memory bank forever. Somewhere between 45 to 65% of our diet should come from carbs. Why is protein so much lower? Is it because protein's less important? No. Is it because Dr. Jenkins is a protein hater? No. We don't need as much protein through diet because our body makes protein for us. Remember, every cell in your body makes protein. Every cell in your body makes protein. Which kind of protein does it make? The non-essential, right? Your body makes over half of its protein for you. So I'm not a protein hater. I'm just saying that we don't need as much through diet because our body makes a lot for us. Okay, so you need to know this percentage range. Okay. Now, for protein, we're also going to get a little bit more specific with grams of protein per kilo of body weight. We didn't really do this as much for carbohydrates and fat, but it is something that we can do that's pretty useful for protein. So in addition to knowing that somewhere between 10 to 35% of our diet should come from protein, I would also like you to know that for a sedentary person, someone who doesn't exercise, they need 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight each day. 0.8. Let me see if I have these. Let's see. Okay. Let's do the math, okay? Let's do the math. Let's say that someone weighs 150 pounds. And you can do this for yourself if you want. Take your weight in pounds. To convert pounds to kilograms, we take our pounds and divide by 2.2. That's my cat coming down. Oh, the fun. Okay, so I have my little calculator out. 150 divided by 2.2. 68 kilos. So we need to convert our weight from pounds to kilograms. And then if I was a sedentary person, not exercising, I would take 68 kilograms times 0.8. So what is 68 times 0.8? 54 grams of protein per day. So that's how you would do it. 0.8 grams of protein. Now, what about athletes? Do athletes need more protein than sedentary people? Of course, the answer is yes. But not as much as you may think. So this is really important. I would like you to know this. You need to know this. Athletes do need more protein. Athletes need more protein, but not as much as you might think. So here are some ranges. And again, we put ranges because everyone's different. So a recreational athlete might need a little bit more. So what do I have here? 0.8 to 1.2 grams per kilogram. A team athlete might be a little bit higher. An endurance athlete a little bit higher. Who's going to need the most protein? A strength athlete. So I'd like you to know that too. I'm not going to ask you the number per se, but let's review. A sedentary person needs about 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. Sedentary, someone who does not exercise, 0.8. Athletes need a little bit more. Not as much as you might think, but athletes need a little more. What type of athlete needs the most strength? This would be weightlifters. This would be our sprinters. High intensity, short duration. When I was making this updated PowerPoint, I was a little hesitant to put 3.0 because that's really high. For most athletes, I would say you wouldn't want to go much higher than 2. 3.0 grams per kilogram of body weight. This is for elite, very, very elite, right? So I wouldn't say go much higher than 2. 3 would be the very elite category. Now, why did we calculate it in grams per kilogram? I'll come back to that in a minute. Why did we calculate it as grams per kilogram? Well, we can't just say, if you're 18 and you're a weightlifter, you need 150 grams of protein. We can't say that because every 18-year-old is a different weight, different height. So by doing this in grams per kilogram, then we're going to get an amount based on kilograms. So someone who weighs less, they don't need as much because they weigh less, right? So it's important that we do it grams per kilogram. Now, you don't need to know these either. I wanted to see what the most current guidelines are, so I went to the International Society of Sports Nutrition. These are their most recent recommendations, and I based mine on them. So what did I say for most athletes? Somewhere in that range, right? So my recommendations that I gave you, I didn't pull them out of my butt. I got them from a reliable source. So for most athletes, that's going to be enough. And that's what I was saying before. Those that are doing strength, they're going to be at the higher end. I really hesitate to go as high as 3 because that's really only going to be for elite, right? And I'm sorry to say, people might think they're elite, but I'm talking about Olympic level, right? You can read more about their recommendations here. I'm not going to ask you about this. I wanted to point out some things that they talked about that I also talked about. Leucine is going to be a really important amino acid. They do talk about dosing of protein, and this is absolutely correct. It's best to spread this out every couple hours throughout the day. Okay. I just said this, but I wanted to make sure there was a slide, and I'm sorry for that circle right there. Why do we not need as much protein through diet as other macronutrients? Because our body makes protein for us. Every single cell in your body makes protein. I mean, how many cells do we have? Billions. Billions of cells. I don't know, millions, billions. It's a lot. So because our cells make protein for us, we just don't need as much through diet. What if you bring in more? I've talked about this already. Let's just talk about it again. When we look at, in this particular country, what makes up the biggest part of our plate? The protein. The protein makes up the biggest part of our plate. And because of that and other things, especially, I've been saying this to you, and when you're older, you'll realize every 10, 15, 20 years, there's a new trend. It used to be carbohydrates. It used to be carbohydrates were good. Carbohydrates used to be good. But now carbohydrates don't have too many carbs. Now we're carbohydrate phobic. And now it's like protein. 10 years from now, it's going to be something else. But what doesn't change are these general recommendations. We need a lot of carbs, energy. Athletes need more protein than non-athletes, but not as much as you think. So if you bring in more protein than you need, what's going to happen? Well, these are some important things I need you to know. Our body cannot store large amounts of protein. Our body cannot store large amounts of protein. It's just true, fact. Can we store large amounts of carbohydrates? Yes, we store carbohydrates as glycogen in the skeletal muscles and in the liver. Can we store carbohydrates? Yes. I think I mentioned this before. You probably have enough carbohydrate stores to run 20 miles. We have a lot of carbohydrate stores. Can we store fat? Yes. We know that. We have adipose, almost endless ability to store fat. But protein, we cannot. It has to do with the structure. It contains that pesky nitrogen. We cannot store large amounts. We can store a little bit, but we can't store a lot. So if you bring in extra, it's not like we can just put it on the storage shelf for later. So if we bring in more than we need, We can break down excess protein. It's performed by your liver and then your kidneys, and we can release the broken down byproducts through urine, but it's difficult. So we can break down and release the contents through urine of some protein, but it's difficult. It's difficult. So we can't store a whole lot, and we can't break down that much very quickly. So what if you bring in more protein than you can store and more protein than you can break down? Well, your body's going to have no choice then to store some of that as fat. So I know that a lot of people think they're doing the right thing. Athletes think, oh, I'm an athlete, I need more protein. So you think you're doing the right thing, but it might be counterintuitive. It might be counterproductive, right? If you bring in more than you need, more than you can store, more than you can break down, it's actually going to be doing the opposite. This is important to know. The power of knowledge. People think they're doing the right thing, but it may not be doing what you think, okay? So I'm not a protein hater. All right. Let's end this with some overall recommendations. These are also from the International Sports Society, and my arrows didn't come through, but I can add them in. So what are our overall recommendations? Athletes need more protein than a sedentary person, but not as much as you think. I would like you to know these. It's best to get all through diet, not through a supplement. Way better to get your protein through diet because you're going to make sure you get your other needed nutrients, vitamins and minerals, carbohydrates and fats. Food is regulated, supplements are not. It's best to spread out your protein intake throughout the day. I think it said every 2 to 3 hours, have some protein. You do not want to bring in protein in large amounts right before and not really during either for most athletes. If an athlete is exercising for over an hour, then we want to consider carbohydrate intake during, not protein. Why? Because we don't use protein for energy. So we need protein after, and we're going to discuss this more in our next video. We need protein after. That's when we're going to need that protein to rebuild muscle, to use it for that structure. High quality essential amino acids are best. I mentioned the importance of leucine. And of course, there's other factors to consider. What type of activity you're doing, your gender, your age. This is a great summary on protein recommendations. The only other thing I want to point out is what type of athlete is going to need the most protein? A strength athlete, weightlifter, sprinter. They're going to need the most out of all the athletes. All right, let me just see what's ahead for a moment. Okay, let's finish this, and then I'm going to pause and start a next video. So one of the things I talked about here is the need for protein after. There's something called a recovery window. Maybe you've heard of it. There is something called a recovery window. We really need to focus on protein, not right before exercise, not during exercise, but after. And it matters when you bring in protein after. There's a recovery window. It's usually somewhere between 30 minutes after a hard exercise session up to 24 hours. This is the recovery window where we need to bring in more protein. The guidelines tell us that it's always best to replenish some within those first 30 minutes. It's always best to replenish some within those first 30 minutes. I don't mean a steak. Maybe some nuts. Maybe some chocolate milk. Something like that. Peanut butter. It's best to have some within 30 minutes. And this can be hard. Think about after a big event. You might go back to the locker room and you might have your talk with the coach. You might have a shower. You might have a bus ride. Those 30 minutes can pass by quickly. So this might involve some planning. And I don't mean McDonald's either. I mean something higher quality, okay? You can make some of those like protein balls with protein and oatmeal or a little bit of chocolate even. It'd be delicious. It can last up to about 24 hours. So it's important to have a little bit of protein within the first 30 minutes. But then a couple hours later, it's good to have more protein. This is when we want to have a bigger meal with more quality protein. I want to point out something. The protein recovery window is shorter in women. The protein recovery window is shorter in women. Physiologically, due mostly to hormones, that protein recovery window is shorter for women. So it's even more important for women to get that protein in quickly. Okay? All right. Last thing I want to say, protein needs increase with age. For men and for women. Our amount of lean muscle mass goes down. Our metabolic rate goes down. So protein needs are going to go up slightly as we age. Okay. There's more information on this table. You don't need to know all these specifics. It's just there if you want. But it's very interesting that the protein recovery window is shorter in women. All right, we're going to stop here, pick it up our next video, and I'll see you soon.